Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Raber. I'm Executive Director of the Shakespeare Association of America, and I'm here to welcome you to this very first non-conference event ever hosted by the Shakespeare Association. I am so glad to see the enthusiastic response we've had for this roundtable, and I hope that we can continue to provide useful and intellectually rewarding programming like this throughout the year. On November 11th at 11 a.m. Central, we'll also host an anti-racist syllabus workshop with Carolyn Sandoval. I hope many of you here today will be able to take advantage of Professor Sandoval's expertise at that event as well. I want to thank some of the staff who've made this event possible. Our project coordinator, Ann Freeman, created the flyers that most of you saw, I think. Beatrice Lay, our assistant executive director, has gone above and beyond in preparing for what is, for us, an entirely new experience with the webinar format. She has been our tech guru throughout this experience. And our new social media intern, Anna Hegland, has set us up on Twitter with hashtag #ShacksSocialJustice so that members can live tweet and continue the conversation there. Finally, I want to apologize to everyone for the omission of accessibility information on the roundtable flyer and elsewhere. That was entirely my fault and was because this was the first time we've done this. We'll remedy that omission in the future for all non-conference event announcements. The SAA does have an ADA policy and a set of recommended best practices for accessibility. They're posted on the website, but those were oriented towards our annual conference, and I will now update them soon to address events like this that don't conform to the conference schedule. Meanwhile, of course, if anyone needs accommodation for any SAA event, you should always feel free to contact our office at shakespeare@olemiss.edu. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Julia Lupton to introduce our speakers today, but I want to thank all of them from the bottom of my heart. They made this an incredibly pleasurable experience, took on an awful lot of work for us and for all of you, and I hope that everybody gets the most out of this and that they enjoy it as much as we are all going to. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, so much, and Beatrice, and of course our interpreters and our panelists and all of you for coming in today to be part of this conversation. Before we get started with the panel, we'd like to get a sense of how all of you understand social justice. So Beatrice is in a minute going to be sharing a screen with a QR code to a word cloud exercise on Mentimeter. And we'd like you just to put in a word or a phrase, take a second to find the site using the QR scanner or the website and the code. And we'd like you to just put in a word about what social justice means to you, a word or a phrase. It's beautiful to see all these words coming in. Some of these themes, of course, will be featured in the commentary by our panelists. And we also have some people contributing via the chat on social justice, so that's great. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our panelists. They are each going to speak for 5 minutes, and then we will have a panel kind of response moment and eventually a chance as well for all of you to contribute your thoughts and questions to this topic. So our first speaker will be Adhar Noor Desai. And Adhar is an assistant professor in the literature program at Bard College, Annandale, where he teaches courses on Shakespeare, poetics, jokes, literary characters, and cultural studies. He is also one of the co-founders, along with Maria Cecere and Krista Caballero, of the OSUN-funded Experimental Humanities Collaborative Network. Our second panelist is Hilary Eklund, and Hilary is Provost Distinguished Professor and Associate Professor of English at Loyola University New Orleans. She is co-editor with Wendy Hyman of Teaching Social Justice Through Shakespeare, Why Renaissance Literature Matters Now. And Wendy Beth Hyman, who is her co-editor, is Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Oberlin College. And she has a forthcoming essay on the value of teaching Ovid and Titus Andronicus during the era of Me Too. Kirsten Mendoza is an assistant professor of early modern studies and human rights at the University of Dayton. Her research and teaching centers on British early modern drama and literature, consent, pre-modern critical race studies, gender, sexuality, and the intersections of law and literature. And then finally, David Ruiter is faculty director of the Teaching and Learning Commons at the University of California, San Diego, which is dedicated to providing equitable, high quality, and accessible educational experiences for all students. He is also an associate professor in theater and dance at UC San Diego, and he is the editor of the Arden Research Handbook of Shakespeare and Social Justice. So I'm going to be turning it over now to Adhar, who is our first panelist.
All right, thank you. Thanks everyone for attending, and thanks to Julia and Karen for convening this event. I'm very excited to learn from my colleagues. So I want to start things off by proposing that we cultivate a responsibility for justice as a learning outcome of courses in Shakespearean literature. Doing this, I think, requires us taking responsibility for our own situatedness as teachers. I'm required to state learning outcomes on my syllabuses for accreditation reasons, but I've embraced the practice as a means of holding myself accountable for specific goals. The learning outcomes also allow me to communicate to students what they're meant to be learning and thinking about. I communicate my learning outcomes regarding the responsibility for justice in two parts, and I'll share them with you just so you can see how I present them. In this course, we will learn about both the historical context of Shakespeare's work, as well as about the historical forces that have placed them onto our syllabus. We will do this by reading Shakespeare's work alongside primary and secondary texts about both early modern England and about the establishment of the English literary canon. In this course, we will endeavor to translate our learning about the relationship between early modern literature, politics, and ideology into an ethics of responsibility relating to our own educational practices. We will do this by studying how poets like Shakespeare use literature to critically reflect upon educational practices, and by considering our own assumptions about how teaching and learning might be revised to emphasize opportunity, freedom, and justice. So yes, these are the learning outcomes that I place on my syllabus to sort of hold myself accountable for the material of the course. Iris Marion Young's Responsibility for Justice observes that the problem with structural injustice is that we cannot trace clear connections between injustice and individual actors or agents who contribute to the operations of the structure. In response, Young suggests a model of social connection that finds that all those who contribute by their actions to structural processes with some unjust outcomes share responsibility for the injustice. What responsibility do we hold as teachers of Shakespeare for the perpetuation of educational injustice? Gowri Viswanathan has amply shown how English literature's affiliation with education matured during the colonial era with the English Education Act of 1835. English colonists, she explains, used Shakespeare and Milton to impose moral values for correct behavior and action over Indians appointed to positions of authority over their compatriots, tethering literary acculturation with a hierarchy of privilege. In the United States, the study of English became formalized with the Harvard entrance exam of 1874. This exam formalized expectations of standard or correct English composition in order to rank and sort students. And it positioned Shakespeare atop the examiner's list of those considered, quote, standard authors about whom the compositions may be written. Coming to terms with the appropriation of Shakespeare by ideological forces that promote inequality, Jonathan Dollimore and Alan Sinfield's Political Shakespeare agitated in 1985 for decoupling Shakespeare from a, quote, apparatus of filtering whereby schools adjust young people to an unjust social order. My learning outcomes for a Shakespeare course then are to help my students see how Shakespeare's writing joins with a long tradition of diverse authors, from John Dewey to James Baldwin to June Jordan to Jacques Rancière to Augusto Boal to bell hooks, who critique the relationship between education and the calcification of injustice and inequality. The course situates him alongside these visionaries in order to equate freedom with the practice of curiosity and with the opportunity to learn. Our reasons for studying Shakespeare, my classroom confesses, are not always innocent, because the structural situatedness of Shakespeare in the modern academy is not innocent. This is not our fault, nor is it Shakespeare's, but it means that our work must be to reckon with how we got here. Fortunately, Shakespeare can help with this. As James Baldwin pointed out, the whole process of education occurs within a social framework that is designed to perpetuate the aims of society. He also pointed out that all societies have battled with that incorrigible disturber of the peace, the artist. He also pointed out, speaking specifically about Shakespeare, that great writers operate as unimpeachable witnesses to one's own experience, and that they are rare because almost no one wishes to have his experience corroborated. What if, alongside helping students see how Shakespeare's plays and their restless ambiguity disturb the peace, the Shakespeare classroom also endeavored to allow students to bear witness to their own experiences as students? We might do this by laying bare how the ideological architecture of the classroom sometimes contorts the practice of education into the business of schooling, which is to say, the business of ranking and sorting. What is the role of grading in a literature course? What are the objectives of the reading list? What if we imagined with our students a world in which education was linked to collaboration, reciprocity, care, generosity, and responsibility, rather than to assessment and mastery? We might ask ourselves, what as teachers are we ethically responsible for providing to the students? And ask our students, what are students ethically responsible for providing to the classroom? We can't help them become responsible for their own education and for the relationship between that education and a practice of justice without showing them that we, too, are willing to be responsible for the education we are offering. Thank you.
Thank you, Adhar. Hillary Eklund is our next speaker.
Hello, thank you to my co-panelists, to Karen and everybody at SAA and Julia for helping to organize. And I also want to say a special word of thanks to those of you who have helped us adjust to the tech situation and make sure that this presentation is accessible for everyone. So I'm going to talk about collaboration. Specifically, I'm interested in using collaboration as an instrument of consent, creativity, and knowledge making in the classroom. While traditional solo authored papers resemble some of the work that we do as professional academics, they really don't represent how people make and share knowledge in other workplaces. So I'm interested in exploring ways to line up academic work with the work that students might do outside and beyond the academy. But furthermore, if I insist that students need to exchange their ideas through discussion in class, what possibilities might open up if I encourage their collaboration on assignments too? Somewhere between papers that specifically prohibit unauthorized collaboration and the dreaded group project, I've been exploring ways to equip my students to effectively make, refine, and share knowledge as part of a community. And that's the language that I'm currently using in my student learning outcomes. Along the way, though, I've discovered that it's not just the assignments that are changing, I'm also changing how and what I teach. Now, part of what set me on this path was the experience of noticing that many of my students simply lacked the skills to collaborate effectively in routine group projects. I started to read about teaching collaboration and to develop some basic handouts and discussions geared towards preparing students to be, decent group members, not deadbeats, not too bossy, that sort of thing. It was also at that point that I was starting to work and think more collaboratively as a scholar. I've been really inspired by the work of Rebecca LaRouche and Jen Monroe, whose collaborations have extended from writing to digital research to cross-campus co-teaching. And I also learned so much by working with Wendy to make our collection 1,000 times better than it would have been if either of us had been solo at the helm. So naturally, I was thinking, how do I bring my students into this experience of discovering the rewards of collaborative work? So I started scaffolding it a bit more in my classes. A friend recommended Asa Mittman's essay, "This Would Be Better If I Had a Co-Author," where Mittman, who's a medieval art historian, breaks down his own process of co-authorship, including his particular strengths as a collaborator, the mechanics of planning, drafting, and revising with a co-author, and the challenges as well as rewards of scholarly collaboration. I use this essay to get students talking about their prior experience of collaboration and what it's taught them about themselves, as well as thinking more about intentional approaches to working with others. And there are two sort of concepts that I want to highlight here. One is consent and the other is metacognition. For me, opting in is an extremely important part of success across the board. So in my classes, collaborations are built on consent. If a course includes 4 short papers, for example, I might tell students they can collaborate on up to 2 of them, but I won't require it. For other kinds of group projects, I encourage students to form their own groups and have serious conversations about how they feel they can best contribute. If, say, a student with social anxiety would prefer to leave the presentation aspect to others, the group needs to decide on an equitable division of labor that allows for that. Related to this is the importance of metacognition. I think it's essential to build in opportunities for students to reflect on their work with others, the effort they've made, the challenges they've faced, the insights they've gained. It helps them to firm up the knowledge they've built about the course material, about collaboration, and of course, their own habits of mind. So to offer just one concrete example, in my Renaissance poetry course this semester, some students have chosen to keep commonplace books throughout the term. And before they start commonplacing on their own, I ask them to research the genre, including the importance of coterie circulation as a way of building communities of knowledge making. Then we recreate this coterie circulation among the commonplacers who comment on and contribute to the assembly of known things in one another's books. So on the one hand, seeing one another's commonplace books encourages students to reflect on their own practices of recording and manipulating knowledge. At the same time, contributing to one another's books shows how well commonplace and how valuable these exchanges were for early moderns. So collaboration is something that I'm just beginning, I feel, to work into my pedagogy in a serious way. But I hope that those ideas offer a little bit of encouragement to others. Thanks.
Thank you, Hillary. You continue, Kirsten. Thank you.
Yes, but thank you everyone for joining us today. And I'm already seeing so many connections between Adhar's work and Hillary's and mine. So this is very exciting. All right, so over the last year and a half, I have had an increasing number of current and former students, particularly from marginalized communities on campus, share with me that they are struggling to stay at the university. They are mentally, physically, and emotionally exhausted. Today, I want us to think together about what it might mean for each of us to prioritize helping students, not just to survive, but to thrive in our Shakespeare classes, in college, and in life. I'm interested in imagining what it could mean for our learning communities to serve what Bell Hooks describes as a home place, a space where we can nurture our spirits and learn to love or respect ourselves, where we can build solidarity and affirm one another, and by so doing, heal many of the wounds inflicted by racist domination. In this short bit, I'm going to raise 2 approaches to helping students thrive that are part of my daily lesson plans and my ongoing reflections on the work I am doing with my students. The first is redefining what it means to thrive. Our seminars as home places can push students to reimagine what our relations to one another in a learning community can be. And the second one is really a basic question, but for me has been the hardest. How do we empower students not just to survive, but to thrive? So to start with, what does it mean to thrive? Many of our students understand thriving as requiring a person to be competitive, to get ahead, to be exceptional. Just listen to your students' anxieties when they talk about professors who grade on a curve. Thriving has directly, or at the very least implicitly, meant at the cost of others, I received my A. Yes, I worked hard for it, but it's also because 80 other people in a class of 100 students scored less than me. But I believe that the Shakespeare classroom can be a place where our learning communities come to recognize that one can thrive in solidarity with others. And it begins with how we talk about Shakespeare's works. Shakespeare stands today as a symbol of white male genius. Any myth of exceptionalism derives from rendering invisible the labor and influences of others. For Shakespeare, that includes effacing the labor of actors, fellow writers, of rendering invisible the sources that inspired the accounts of love and violence, of dispossession and trauma that Shakespeare drew upon. It means ignoring that Shakespeare's privileged place is tied to the institutions that have put him there. In general, this erasure of labor diminishes a sense of the privileges and opportunities that enable specific people to flourish, which is why I second Adhar in the importance of providing students with an understanding of the cultural milieu of early modern England and of the forces that have transfixed him in the central space in the Western canon. The attention we give to help our students view Shakespeare as connected to others can also be replicated in terms of our classroom dynamics. How can we reorientate our students' perceptions of thriving? As Karen Buenavista Hanna points out, students who carry class conversations are often the ones who are privileged to feel entitled to be there and have their ideas matter, usually reified through racist, ableist, right, xenophobic norms. And one can say that this is particularly true, at least at the very beginning, in those first few sessions in our Shakespeare classroom. Students expect that they will be asked to demonstrate what they learned at the end of the course, but they are not often asked to think deeply about their processes of learning in connection to the labor of a classroom community. I've been trying to encourage an ethics of remembrance, care, and generosity. In student responses, I now ask them to reflect on how the combination of a scholar's work and another student's contributions to our class discussions have ignited questions they want to pursue. And I use those responses to shape forthcoming sessions. And on a side note, this has also allowed me to have students who normally are not as verbally present in the class, right, to actually center their ideas in terms of how they are framing our discussion and the work we do in amplifying other people's generative ideas. So it's really this community endeavor that I'm really trying to showcase every time we enter the classroom. Lastly, if helping students to thrive also requires that we empower them to recognize the value in their work and in themselves, then why not have students engage with representations from Shakespeare in which they can find meaning that builds them up, representations that could be soul edifying rather than destructive. In a roundtable conversation organized by the Chicago Shakespeare Theater, David Sterling Brown raised an important issue that has since stuck with me. What does it mean if a Black student first thinks of Othello as their reason for taking a Shakespeare course? Brown asked, why Othello, a character consumed by self-deprecation, and not Aaron, a character who, unlike other parental figures in Shakespeare's corpus, actually defends his son's life, a father who unapologetically states the worth of his Black child in the face of white violence and terror. Even in the processes of having our Shakespeare seminars critique and expose the differential treatment of people, we may be inadvertently diminishing the kind of intellectual and soul edifying work and joy that our students need. I don't have a single approach to empowering students or one that necessarily always works. And I'd love to learn from you all today in terms of what you do in your spaces of learning. But one thing that has changed my orientation to teaching has been to literally write at the start of every lesson plan what I will do in my attempts to empower students today through specific ways, and then to reflect and hold myself accountable for what I did that day to encourage students not just to survive, but to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten.
I will especially thank the person who put in the word cloud, radical empathy as a form of social justice. So thank you for your humor and patience with me figuring out the technology. I wanted to share a few thoughts about my syllabi and how I try to work with some learning objectives that connect the intellectual work in the classroom with the work of social justice. And I just, again, want to thank SAA for making space for this conversation, and all of my co-panelists who have personally inspired me in so many ways. This is obviously a pretty selected list of learning objectives, but there are a few that I think connect to our charge today: becoming active producers rather than passive consumers of meaning, actualizing a community of care and learning in the midst of real-world trauma, engaging the intellectual as well as ethical benefits of doing social justice work, seeing historical literature as part of an ongoing conversation with current social issues in which we can and should intervene, and confidence in creating many and diverse Shakespeares. Some of my thoughts are influenced by what we've just been through in the last year and a half, and I added to my syllabi this note that we would be working within a no gaslighting zone, and that I understand that we are living through a pandemic, an uprising, a fraud election, an insurrection, environmental crises, racist violence, economic uncertainty, and more. I think that I wanted my students to understand, above all, that my goal was to continue working and learning together, regardless of what version of the world we found ourselves in, which of course, very few of us knew what to anticipate. And I've kept a version of this on my syllabi even now as we've returned to in-person teaching. In order to make my students participate as co-creators and feel empowered to intervene in a long-standing conversation, I've tried to share with them throughout classes some of the contemporary visions and revisions of Renaissance art and literature, so that Shakespeare shares space with Toni Morrison or Keith Hamilton Cobb on my syllabi, and so that classes think about an ongoing intervention in which the student is an equal creative co-conspirator. Sometimes there are special events that occur, such as this wonderful conversation between 3 feminist translators and poets who are responding to Ovidian and Shakespearean myth. And these kinds of events and the art that I share with my students is really meant to inspire them to see what they can try. I'll share with you at the end some of the logistics of what this looks like in my classes, but I'll just say broadly now that I invite all of my students to choose their own adventure in my courses, to decide for themselves what they most want to learn and what outcomes they would like to devise in order to demonstrate that learning. Early in my career, I would only allow them 10% of the course grade to choose on their own, maybe do a recitation or a film analysis. But as my experience of trusting students has increased and the quality of the work that I've seen has increased, I've given them as much as 60% of the grade that we decide together how they will determine. And so I'll share with you now the kinds of things that have emerged when I've de-emphasized paper writing as the only way of demonstrating learning and encourage students to become much more creative in connecting what they care about, the social justice causes that matter to us now, and what they're learning in the early modern classroom. And these are just a very brief sampling. This student who read Titus Andronicus and the Myth of Philomel, who's now doing a master's degree at Gallaudet University, actually learning to sign, did a project for the class where she created a ASL gloss and then an English interpretation of the Myth of Philomel, wrote a short paper accompanying it and all the ways in which she was wrestling with what it means to give Philomela a voice. This student who struggled with eating disorders used the idea of hath not a Jew eyes to create a short video.
Hath not a woman eyes? Hath not a woman's hands, organs, dimensions,
senses, affections, passions?
Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons,
and subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means.
You'll notice as you listen to that video that there are several different voices involved. That student brought in a number of other students in the class to voice different portions of the speech, and like many other assignments, became a collaborative exercise. This student, who is a music composer, wrote poems and questions in relationship to several mythological figures, and then composed music that you could listen to as you walked through the town square, reading the poems that were attached to each of the trees, effectively creating a site-specific installation in relationship to our readings. This student, who read Sir Philip Sidney and Kim Hall, rewrote a suite of sonnets, all of them about loving Blackness in different forms and working with the idea of the blazon and reapplying it in really important ways. I've had students design lesson plans and entire syllabi for how they would teach some of these materials at the high school level. And I had a student who was the editor of the school newspaper use the themes of one class and rewrite them and imagine them in contemporary context. Of course, not every project is social justice forward per se. An assignment like this student creating a curiosity cabinet was pretty delightful. But there's just been an array of things that I have found that when I trust my students, they have been able to produce. So I won't dwell on these last slides too much because they're really dense. I'd be glad to email them to anybody. But I basically give students a menu of options for what it might look like to compose an array of assignments for their own learning goals. I give some sample templates for what the points might look like, and we really do collaborate together what the ultimate goal is. And then each student submits an accounting sheet where they identify what their learning goals are, what they're trying to achieve with each one, how many points they want assigned for each one. And so the goal of all of this, of course, is to move beyond just the contract grading assumptions that if you make your best effort, you will not fail, you will do well, but also to become a real active co-creator in what you would like to produce for the class and learn, and use me as a collaborative source to think about how to organize that. So thanks very much. It's really been a pleasure hearing from everyone.
Thank you, Wendy. And our final panelist is David.
Thank you, Julia. And thanks for all the work that you and Lindsay and Karen have done to get us all organized for this event. It's really an honor for me to be here today with you, with my fellow panelists, with the interpreters, and with the whole audience gathered here. And I'm so happy we're having this conversation. Charles McNulty said in yesterday's Los Angeles Times, quote, "Art at its Shakespearean finest isn't a repository for wisdom, but an interrogation of what we think we know. It's one of the rare opportunities in our polarized world to contemplate how we live and might live as a community." One means by which I have been able to interrogate and bridge my work with Shakespeare with my other role in higher education administration, focused on the access and success of historically underserved students, has been through the use of hospitality as a social justice learning outcome, one that allows us to consider how we live and do our work, and how we might live and work as a more wholesome community, empowering to each member. Hospitality, as the work of Julia and others in this room continues to show, can take many ethical shapes. For today, I will just focus on one provided by Emmanuel Levinas and take the perspective that hospitality is characterized by A, response to, and B, responsibility for the other. So on to the classroom. When students begin my class, they will be asked two questions via Canvas or Blackboard at the start of the course. One, How would you define hospitality, or what does hospitality mean to you? And 2, what does hospitality mean to you in terms of how you treat others? As a learning community, we then take what they provide via the discussion boards, we dialogue, and we create a draft document of our principles, our shared principles of hospitality for that class. And then we follow up with short readings from Levinas and Kimberly Crenshaw to begin to develop together a sense of intersectional hospitality and consider the relationship of identity to hospitality, and then to go back and update our draft principles. So at this point in the course, we have foregrounded an ethic of hospitality as defined by our specific learning community, using the students' lived experience and the help of some thought leaders, and created a flexible framework for discussion of the plays and poems based on a consideration of response to and responsibility for the other. Then, as McNulty says, we can turn to the plays and poems as a rare opportunity for us to discover what the plays hold, how the plays work, and later why this matters and how it functions within a disciplinary, institutional, or cultural context. Or, as Chris Anthony has said, the plays offer not just an opportunity, but a rare social justice venue on which we can play out dialogically, constructively, considerations of our understanding and ethical treatment of others. So I would quickly invite you to consider some of the following examples that I've made use of in the classroom. How do Lear, Gloucester, Cordelia come to terms with a new vision or new visions of hospitality and community, of response and responsibility to others? How does Portia do this? How does hospitality work within Shakespeare's imagined culture of Venice? How does Duke Senior respond to inhospitable behavior? How does Prospero? So with these examples, you can see that in doing this work, the idea is to provide a way and means for students to become aware of thinking together with Shakespeare, or through Shakespeare, or beyond Shakespeare. But of course, we can also play act response and responsibility by having students individually, with classmate or friend or even family groups, video record scenes from Shakespeare that allow them to integrate their own visions and cultures of hospitality with those from the plays. And in this way, there is the opportunity to begin to truly create the at-home feeling with Shakespeare, stripping away the austerity or the presumed authority, and instead, in its place, creating further community. There remains, of course, questions as to how at home students can truly feel with Shakespeare, with their peers, with me as the instructor, with the way the discipline operates. Who is welcome? Who is welcomed? And with what proof or passport? Who is less welcomed or unwelcome? What language and discourses are favored or discouraged? How does response and responsibility work ethically, work towards social justice in all of these contexts? And we don't have time to get into all of that here, but I am suggesting that the students leave the course with not just better skills and content knowledge of Shakespeare, but a stronger sense of themselves as agents in groups, communities, and cultures that continue to struggle with true hospitality and other social justice issues, and are in need of their talents, the students' talents, identities, standpoints, and positions. They, the students, have a role to play. They are capable and confident to play it in class, at the university, and in the larger world. We would then end the class with another Canvas or Blackboard discussion, focusing on the initial questions and considering how the students have progressed in their thinking, their agency, and their leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And thank you, panelists, for such a range of wonderful ideas and experiences and possibilities for us to think about. We're going to shift now to having the panelists all visible for a daisy chain conversation amongst themselves, and also entertaining SAA member questions. So Adhar is going to ask Hillary a question, and then we'll do a few more of these. and then we'll open it up to you, the SAA membership.
All right, thanks. Yeah, it was so invigorating to hear about everyone else's work and see the sort of commonalities and points of contact. So I wanted to follow up with Hillary in particular about a thread that appeared across several of these about collaboration. And I think one of the challenges that I have as a teacher is when I have students do non-traditional sorts of assignments or work that is not rooted in writing an essay and getting a grade. It's hard to communicate to them like why this work is what we're doing and what they're meant to be learning from it. And so at the heart of my question is, how do you, Hillary, and how might we as a discipline sort of make strides towards ennobling collaborative work as a source of agency and an explicit counterpoint to individualism, authorial singularity, competition, right? How do we both verbally communicate to our students that what we're learning here is the possibilities of collaboration as a political practice, and how do we implement that like in our course policies to encourage students to really attend to those responsibilities?
Thanks. I love this question, and I think one thing that this is a really kind of dumb and low key way to respond to your really smart question, but one practice that I've developed in the last couple of years with assignments is that every assignment, at the first thing I list on the assignment handout is the purpose of this assignment. What are we doing here? You know, connecting it back to student learning outcomes, but also sort of anticipating how can I get a student to sort of conceptualize this thing from beginning to end with the purpose, and then at the end, the sort of criteria for success, which is what I use instead of rubric. I use criteria for success. So making it clear why we're doing it, and then also if students are doing different projects, which in my classes, as in Wendy's, often they are, thinking about what are the common threads that sort of tilt towards the same learning outcomes. But the part of your question about ennobling collaboration is something that I've been thinking more about. And obviously there are lots of different approaches to this. You can thematize collaboration by, you know, having students study early modern playwrights who collaborate. We could do, you know, a unit on Beaumont and Fletcher, for example. But one of the assignments that I think has worked really well, and I'll just tell like a story about this assignment, because I think it gets to the heart of what you're talking about, is in the context of a first-year seminar that I teach from time to time called Shakespeare's Worlds. And when I taught this last, I had a particularly boisterous group of first-year students, many of whom were English majors. And in this class, they do a group project called Shakespeare's Theatrical Worlds, in which they adopt a playwright, a non-Shakespearean playwright. And in addition to researching the bio and oeuvre of that playwright, they situate one of their particular plays in a particular theater in London. So the research process is really extensive, and it involves them interfacing with digital collaborations like the map of early modern London, records of early English drama, early modern London theaters, and even a little bit of 6 Degrees of Francis Bacon. So that gives us a chance to sort of talk about scholarly collaborations in the professional sphere and think about these alternative products to sort of traditional literary critical scholarship, journal articles, and that sort of thing. But then, so this one semester, I had a group of students that chose Ben Jonson, and I had another group of students that happened to choose Thomas Middleton. And friends, the long story short, they found out about the Poets' War. And the Poets' War is not a thing that I have spent much time thinking about, but when these maniacs discovered that that was a thing, they lost their minds. They just went all in. And I think they knew that it wasn't going to be a major feature of their presentation, but they went on this extracurricular like deep dive and sent me updates about it and just got really excited. And for me, it was just a wonderful lesson in the unintended benefits of pedagogical experiments and the ways that their minds were lit up by thinking about aesthetic debates, thinking about debates about the purposes of art, but also challenging their notions of single authorship. So it's not really something that I planned, but it was an instance of collaboration sort of yielding these greater insights that I couldn't have predicted.
Thank you, Hillary. Could you please ask Wendy a question?
Sure, I will. Thank you. So Wendy, you and I have talked a lot about many of these topics, including cultivating spaces where students can sort of hold on to their knowledge lightly instead of with an iron grip. And I'm really curious about how you translate some of these practices of cultivating receptivity and openness in more formal writing assignments, if you do that. So I know that you students are choosing their own adventures for a lot of your assignments, but they're also probably doing writing, as many of us, will still do. So how have you gone about scaling this approach to more formal writing assignments? And I'm recalling a blog post that you wrote about choosing your own adventure a couple of years ago, where you write, it took a good amount of planning to set up, a significant amount of flexibility to administer, and a willingness to take a real leap of faith in my students. So could you also talk about what that leap of faith has entailed for you and what difference it makes when we start by trusting students, as Jessie Stonewall says?
I love both those questions. I'll try to answer each of them quickly. I'll start with the second one. I think I have gotten better at translating a student's interest into a thing that they might be able to do, if you see what I mean. So they will come to me with something kind of undefined, but with a curiosity, and I just leap on it. So yesterday I had a student who she performs in circus on campus, and she is actually graduating early to become a full-time circus performer. And she said, I love the video I made in the other class for you, and I kind of want to do something with dance and circus, and I don't know, I'm kind of interested in time, and didn't you write a book on automatons? Those are cool too. And I said, great, how about a research project where you find out about early modern motion? I made some references like Mike Whitmore's work, and suggested that she create an annotated bibliography about her research, and then choreograph a dance and record it, and perhaps create a kind of educational material attached to it so she could share it with someone. So there was a research component, a writing component, a creative component. It requires me to be creative, right? Because I don't know what they're going to bring to me. I can't can a assignment for someone who's in circus. I just need to be able to think. So I've gotten better at it. So that kind of answers that question about taking a leap of faith. Every time I've done it, really just without exception, something wonderful has come back. And the more I've trusted my students, the better the work has been. What if we act as if you are doing this because you really want to learn? You really have things that you want to share, and you need the professor to have enough adaptability to help connect those things. So that's been my charge, instead of here's a topic, write about it. As for formal papers, I do actually require an analytical essay of every student in every class. I've just only made that a component of the work they do. There's kind of nothing like it, but there's nothing like all these other things as well. I would say that what I've put on the syllabus about class discussion, I've also applied to papers, which is the art of being able to change your mind. And in fact, I say in class, what if you thought about what can I change my mind about today, every day? So that we don't just write essays where we find a thesis, make a claim and defend it at all costs. Like, look at what that has wrought in the last X number of years in this country. But instead, really practice the process of being able to change your mind, rethink things, what kind of evidence would enable you to change your claim? And so I let people know that a great grade in class participation is actually performing the work of thinking and changing your mind instead of just simply defending a claim. And then I apply that to formal papers as well. So I invite students to foreground the pieces of evidence that don't fit their argument and to leave them as open questions for some other future paper or some other reader to engage with, instead of hiding that or sweeping it under the rug. Actually make it a feature. And as we all know, sometimes when you do that, you find a great answer there, and sometimes you don't. And the mess itself is what's interesting.
Thank you, Wendy. Would you please ask Kirsten a question?
I would love to. So Kirsten, I noticed some of your comments, and I've been thinking a lot about this question about how what is urgent is not necessarily a fixed category, right? The desire for justice may feel fixed, but what we address ourselves to is somewhat mobile. And I'm thinking of my own example here too. I don't know that I thought defending a claim in a paper was toxic until the last 4 or 5 years, where I started thinking, oh, if that's all we teach them to do, like, what is that? What has come of that? So as world events change and we change, and our institutions and the populations we serve change, and the problems we feel the need to solve change, what are your ways of responding to those shifts? How do you feel about how to account for what feels urgent now to these students in this time and place? How do we let go of what no longer serves the students or the most pressing causes we're feeling? How do we, like with integrity, embrace what feels most urgent now?
Yeah, Wendy, and I do have to admit that recognizing that the way we write papers and we encourage students to defend a thesis at all costs, it wasn't until you had mentioned that, right, that this also connected for me. So thank you for doing that. I think if I can grab onto multiple people too, there's this way in which I guess in terms of my approach, I think of two things. Number one, it's one of the things that Captain Schwartz told me. I think she was referring though to like the ways that universities just work in general and inclusivity on campuses, et cetera. But one of the things that she had mentioned is that unless you foreground the importance and the value of historically and continue to be marginalized communities based on class, on race, on ableism, right? If you don't stress the importance, the institution itself will revert. So you have to actively, not just in the back of your head say, I'm committed to this, right? But actively take strides. And I think that's one of the things that our whole group is trying to think about, right? How do we take an idea and to actually employ that, right, in our daily lived experiences, also in the classroom, in our institutions, in our communities that we're working with. And the second thing actually draws on what you had mentioned in terms of trusting our students. So the response that I had shared with you all actually derives from another practice that I've been using in my classes, which is I oftentimes take notes after class. I take notes on the things that students have said. I also pay attention to students who are quieter in class, right? And also I give them opportunities to provide me with feedback that are low stakes. And then I use that information to structure the next session. And then I am the one to draw attention to specific contributions of students, the questions that they want to address. And what I noticed after the first 4 weeks, and I have to admit that virtual learning was actually helpful because people can see the names of their peers, right? And I noticed that after the first 4 weeks that you actually started seeing some students start to mimic that same kind of citation of others, right? Referencing a comment that another student had made several sessions ago to show how our information, our learning is building. And now I'm asking myself, well, how can I continue to encourage this? right? And this is why now, in terms of responses, rather than have students respond on their, right, their readings of particular texts, right, before discussions, it's more of an after discussion, reflection, and response that they have to write, in which they're bringing together a scholar's work, but also something that a student had said. And this goes to trusting your students, because now, instead of myself being the one to draw those connections between students, I'm having them be responsible. I think this also attaches to what Adhar was talking about earlier in terms of what is our responsibility as instructors in the classroom, and also in terms of our students, what is their responsibility? It is their responsibility now also to be in community with others and to acknowledge the labor of our communal learning. And so that is the next step that I'm doing, and I have to admit that it worked really well once again during my summer Shakespeare seminar virtual. It's a little bit harder now that we're in-person classes. I will state too that about 3 weeks into the seminar, the Muslim prayer room at the University of Dayton, which is a Marianist Catholic institution, was just vandalized. And at that point, we were also talking about the Merchant of Venice. And in one of the responses that a student had made, they were reflecting on how one of our students who wears the hijab, right, how she had mentioned, why is it that the Prince of Morocco begins with mislike me not for my complexion, right? Why wouldn't he have also been Muslim? In a play that so foregrounds divisions in religion, why is it that it's complexion that is primarily upheld regarding the Prince of Morocco? And then, so another student had noticed that and said, this makes me think also about the sections we read from Geraldine Heng. And so normally once again, what I would use is I would use those responses to begin, right, the discussion and to talk about those particular students and their questions. But instead, I actually had them break into small groups with one another. And I wanted my Muslim student in that class to hear from another student why it is that those ideas were particularly meaningful. And then they shared that with the group, with the whole class. So I'm trying to build connections to empower and validate, right, students in our classrooms who perhaps in the past have not felt that. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you, Kirsten. And Kirsten, would you please ask David a question? Give us a second.
I'm wondering if David and Adhar, perhaps this might be something that both of you would like to talk about regarding questions of hospitality. And when we think about hospitality, it's also very much an affective dimension to that. There are preconceived notions, right, that we bring into the classroom simply by our presence, and also in relation to the specific community of the classroom. So my question is really quite simple. It's how do you build rapport with your students? How do you, over the course of teaching, we know that the way we present to our students, the way that they will engage with us will change based on the specific group of students that we're working with, but also how we are changing, right? Over the course of our teaching lives. So I'm curious if you can just talk more about that affective dimension, how that relates with your embodiment as a professor.
So thanks, Kirsten. And yes, Adhar and I will share this one out. First thing I need to say is that for much more on this topic, everybody has to come back on November 11 and be here with my amazing colleague, Dr. Carolyn Sandoval, to talk about anti-racist pedagogies in the classroom, where she can explain a great deal about how this can work over the course of the semester and through all the materials and interactions that we have. Beyond that, Kirsten, I would say, I'll try to be brief and leave space for Adhar here. One thing that has been tremendously valuable to me over time and was presented to me originally by some of my colleagues when I was at the University of Texas at El Paso, Drs. Erica Mean and Maite de la Piedra, is on an asset-based approach to teaching and learning. That work builds on earlier community development work done by John McKnight, but what it suggests is that we make sure that when our students come to us, we do things to make sure that they have opportunity to articulate the assets, the abundance that they're bringing into this teaching and learning community. Maybe those are personal skills or experiences, academic talents, professional workplace, job skills, cultural assets, linguistic talents, all these sorts of things. And we actually now take time at the beginning of the class to do on the discussion board, ask the students this question about what are they bringing in? What are they bringing into this teaching and learning community that's going to help enrich our community? Have them begin to articulate that, do a little pair share work, and have people report out on their peers' talents and things like that. And it's just a way to make sure that we're draining out any sort of deficit framing that might be in, that the students come in to the classroom, well, they don't know that much about Shakespeare. Well, probably that may be true. That's why they're here. But they do know a lot about a lot of things, and they do have a lot to bring into this discussion. And I love, Kirsten, how you've just set up the result of this, is that when they are empowered in their abundance to have these conversations, it's transformative also to me as an instructor, and then to the whole environment, because now I get to work within that abundance in this classroom and design conversations and assignments and opportunities for them that will facilitate both what they see as their strengths and things that they would like to work on and to develop over that time. But the main thing is, I think, to make sure that, honestly, that everyone's identity is seen as contributing to the growth and possibility of what we're going to discover together in this learning community. And then I'll hand to Adhar.
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I think a lot of the way that I approach this problem is in the first day of class. And what I try to do to make the space inviting and welcoming and hospitable to students is to try to, as clearly as possible, articulate what I see as my role and my goals for the class and for myself. And in a phrase that I sometimes use, I tell my students explicitly, I'm not here to be the cops. I'm here because I love this literature, warts and all, and I want you to see what I see. And I'm going to try to present it to you in as honest a way as possible, because I think what we'll find in this literature is a sort of a mandate to be creative, to be critical, to think on our feet, because that's what makes for good poetry. So we'll study John Donne because his mind is ever restless, and I want your minds to be restless. And I want you to show me your restless thought. I'm never going to punish you for not understanding these difficult texts. I'm going to ask you to share your current understanding so that I'll give you I can offer feedback, so we can correct or amend the things that you couldn't possibly have known before you read these texts, right? That I say, like, I'm here as your encyclopedia about the early modern world because I spent a long time studying it, and I don't expect you to have that. I want you to try to read these things closely because I think there's wonderful stuff in there, and I want you to raise your opinions about them, because the work of this class is primarily learning to grow comfortable with difficult texts. And so I'm gonna assume that you're gonna try your hardest to rise to the challenge these texts present. And I'm never going to assume that you're not trying your best. I'm gonna treat all of your work as seriously as I would treat my own peer-reviewed articles to be treated. I try to literally say all of this on the first day of class. And then the real hard part is then, over the course of the semester, shaking loose my own ingrained sort of educational upbringing, where if a student asks for several extensions, not judging them and not being frustrated, right? Having taking the extra effort and having the conversation and asking what's going on. Why do you need, can I help you, encourage you to engage with this course in a way that might be more timely, right? It is like shaking free my own type A mentality to meet my students where they are. That has been the hardest part, but I think sharing up front, I'm not here to punish you. I don't like the bad vibes of being the antagonist is not something that I think is conducive to good literary study. So let's just start from there. What can we learn together? I picked these cool poems. Can we read them? Right. So yeah, it is this affective, but also sort of policy-based move.
Beautiful. Thank you, panelists, for the daisy chain. And we have a lot of questions from SAA members. Some of these are for Wendy, and she has been answering some of those in the chat, but they revolve around workload, how you scale up for, let's say, a class of 120 students without a TA, how you deal with students for whom collaboration is not an opportunity, but a burden, and also how you deal with the workload for the instructor in terms of grading and organizing all of the kind of conferencing that would be involved with this kind of work. So Wendy, maybe you could comment on that, on some of those practical issues, keeping in mind that our membership teaches at all sorts of different kinds of universities and colleges with various constraints.
Right. So I'll definitely have to defer to people who have lectures of 100 or 200.
I think we don't have, do we have our ASL available at the moment? Let's make sure we're pinned properly.
So I teach at a small liberal arts college. My largest class is 50 people. So what works in my setting may not work the same way as yours. I hope that what I'm doing could be scaled. I will say that what I do in a seminar of 15 people is different than what I do in the class of 50. I personally find that grading papers is hard and time intensive, and it's the same thing again and again, and my goodwill can wear down. So to me, even though the conferences are time consuming, it's just, there's so much variety. And the same thing with the work that I get, that I find it's just much more energizing and engaging. I will say that there are a number of factors that go into what kinds of things I enable and at what level. So a 100 level class, I wouldn't want to give them 60% of the grade. I think that would be terrifying for them. They're not necessarily ready. I might give them 10 or 15, but by the time that they're juniors or seniors, then it would be at least half of the grade in most classes. It was a little less during the pandemic because I figured people had more of a cognitive burden. There's a little bit of intuition here and just trying it out. I think in a bigger class, some things that I've done is encourage students to do Zoom performances or enact scenes. So there's only one graded thing that I need to do for 4, 5, or 6 students. So that kind of thing can be scalable. In terms of difficult schedules, Joel, I saw you mention the way in which collaboration can be a burden. So Google Docs, right? Like something that allows them to contribute on their time and their schedule. And I've also built in something that I don't know if this is cheating, but or if it's just survival, but if you want my written feedback or my verbal feedback, I need it by X date. And I have sometimes asked students if they're willing to receive verbal feedback, because I find that I have carpal tunnel, my wrists get tired after writing comments. So I tell them I'll give them feedback in whatever mode they want, but if they're open to verbal, that's really helpful to me. And then if they want more time, more than they want the feedback, then they can turn in a major assignment the last day of class or during the exam period, but they won't get feedback. So it's kind of an escape clause for me. That way, anyone who's gotten things in early, I have the time to really substantively engage. And people who get it to me on the last day, I just don't give the same level of response. So those are a few things that I've done to try to manage what I can do and also what I can ask of them at different levels and size classes.
Thank you, Wendy. I think this is a question for Adhar about sort of students moving from a business model of education to this more contract of working on outcomes with you. And how does that relate to the fact that students come to your class with very different high school experiences of what it means to, succeed and, complete an academic course of study? Could you address that?
Yeah, this is a really important question, and I think it's fundamental to any classroom that has the values that we're trying to promote. And one way that I think about this, and I think this also relates to the question about scaling the sort of work, and I totally am sympathetic. I mean, yeah, it's a privilege to teach at a 20-student seminar versus a 200-student lecture. And my philosophical approach to it, beyond the practical, is to think about the role of assignments in a Shakespeare class in general. Why are we assigning the work that we're assigning them to do, especially if we don't like slogging through it and they don't like slogging through it? Something is wrong. So just starting the semester from the approach of, what if one of the goals of the class, because it's a class in literature where the work that students have to do is both reading and writing, and we evaluate their writing more readily than we do their reading. What if the goal of the class is also to make them fall in love with the work of writing? Not to fall in love with Shakespeare, but to fall in love with criticism. And for me, I fell in love with criticism when I realized that it was something that you kind of do with your teacher. That in graduate school, when you have an advisor who will look at your words and shape them into something smarter than you would have come up with, or in undergrad, when I work with my thesis advisor, where she would take my harebrained ideas about Shakespeare, as Pat Parker, very seriously, right? And it's so empowering to have somebody like that take your work seriously. And I think so, regardless of how students enter your class and their background, if you start from the premise of, how do I make it so that their past experiences as writers don't really play a role in the experience that they will have here, because we will work with them from the start. And in terms of scale, I see this as one practical implementation is, why do we have them write several essays over the course of a semester? Does that really always make them better essay writers as opposed to better deadline artists? Right? What if the essay project is something that begins early, involves a first round of scaffolding, maybe they do an annotated bibliography, and all along the way, they just get feedback from their professor on things that they might look at or ways that they may frame the things that they're interested in, kind of like Wendy's negotiation with their students about the collaborative work. Why not see the creative work? Why not see the critical work as creative work too, that they can have the resource of their professor to help them through? And if you scaffold all of this work and reward them for doing all the minor work along the way, you can meet the student where they are, help them, if the goal is to help them become better paragraph writers as opposed to better readers of critical literature, reward the student for becoming a better paragraph writer, right? Grade them on their own terms as opposed to a standard that the whole class is at. And you will see their development over the course of the class and reward them for how far they've come rather than what they failed to achieve. So there's a variety of things, but like generally, just ask yourself whether the work that everyone is being made to do in your semester is actually serving the goals that you want your class to have.
Beautiful. And this is a question for the panel as a whole. So maybe Hillary or Kirsten or David, or you could just address this question briefly, all of you. Could you speak a bit about the process of having students create their own learning goals and what kind of instruction or frameworks you provide for that? So maybe someone can jump in.
I'd be glad to jump in because this is something that I've done fairly recently. Copying Wendy, because all good pedagogy is theft. I started doing some choose your own adventure approaches of my own in Shakespeare classes. And I found it really useful for the students' first assignment to be a work plan. And this sort of links to a lot of what David was talking about earlier with asset approaches or asset-based approaches. So they take an inventory of what they can contribute to the class, but they also state, you know, kind of where they are and where they'd like to be by the end of it. If their goal is to learn more about Shakespeare or the historical circumstances of early modern theater, then they can choose assignments that are geared towards that, and they will measure their own progress against those benchmarks they set for themselves. So we can yoke to metacognition and those reflection exercises, even self-assessment. And self-assessment is not a replacement for instructor feedback, but it does get us out of the odious work of grading and the sort of carceral implications of punishing people who are differently prepared for college work because they didn't have the same class, AP English classes in high school. So I'll hand it over to Kirsten or David if they want to say something.
Yeah, I will state that for me, the midterm period is such an important stage in terms of just requesting feedback from students. At the very start of the seminar, I always have students reflect on the topic of the course and what they would like to learn, right? And of course, this is before we really get into substantive conversations. And what I asked them to do around midterms is, number one, to reflect on what questions they had set out to possibly tackle, but also how those questions have changed, right? And so based on where we are at midterms, this is where, once again, I start to think about reframing the class. And I will think too that, so Laura Dodds, was it 2 years ago, Wendy, when we were at MLA? I can't remember now, time is, one of the things that she had mentioned is that she allows students to help decide on the next play they're going to study together. And I remember in the past being like, that sounds really awesome. But as also a new faculty with multiple new preps, right? I'm a little bit terrified of that, to be quite frank. I think this goes back to the question of, scale, right? In terms of what happens when you have over 100 students, or what happens when you're a new faculty or a lecturer in which you're balancing multiple courses outside of your field and you're teaching. And so, yes. And so what I will state is that that is something that now that I've had more teaching under my belt, now that I'm repeating preps, I actually feel more emboldened to go back to what Wendy had said, trust my students, right? And I'm wondering if, this is also something to say about how we are changing as instructors, how we are learning once again from one another, as Hillary had mentioned, but also how the different forces and pressures of us as instructors in the institutions are also affecting what we can do with our students, right? And the limitations that we have, the very real limitations in terms of energy, goodwill, etc. Yeah.
Great. Well, we are running out of time, and there is a question here about sort of why Shakespeare and what Shakespeare has to offer as a thinker. And since we were going to end with a word cloud, I think maybe this is a question that we could actually answer collectively. So we have a final word cloud, and we're asking you to put in something Shakespearean that for you is a portal to a social justice pedagogy or practice, a character, a play, a theme, a word, an image, stage direction. And this kind of brings it back to Shakespeare as we return to our Zoom free moments and are starting to plan for Monday's class. So hopefully people can get onto the word cloud, and you can also put it into the chat if you would like. But we're starting to see our word cloud build. Beautiful. Beautiful. And I'm enjoying the chat too. Exeunt. All exit as an empowering moment. What does it mean to exit and to enter? Beautiful. Beautiful. So as people are finishing up with that, adding their thoughts to the word cloud, their phrases, sonnet numbers, characters, stage directions, it's great to see the variety of things. I just want to thank Karen for having the idea of broadening SAA membership meetings beyond the conference and kind of building on the tools that we've all learned in the past year and a half. And it was great to have so many people interested in attending this event. And I hope that we'll see some of you back for the syllabus event, and that you will also let SAA know what other kinds of activities might work in this format, and all of that great stuff. And of course, I want to thank our amazing ASL interpreters and Beatrice and our panelists and everybody else. Karen, do you want to say goodbye to?
I want to say thank you to Julia, who did a tremendous job of keeping everything organized and on track and on schedule. And thanks to all the panelists. This was amazing. And of course, to all the members who joined us. And I am going to officially close this meeting. Thank everybody for being here. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate this.